The chill of the old hospital always set in around midnight. The cracked walls and flickering lights created an eerie atmosphere, casting long shadows that danced across the corridors. I had just started my night shift as a security guard, and the place already felt like a scene from a horror movie. It was the kind of quiet that made you listen too closely, catching every creak and groan of the old building. I was making my rounds, checking the usual spots. Most nights were uneventful, just me, my flashlight, and the distant hum of fluorescent lights. But this night was different. As I passed the staff room, a strange glow caught my eye. It wasn't the usual dull light from the ceiling fixtures, but a soft, almost ethereal shimmer. Curious, I moved closer. As I approached, the glow intensified. It seemed to pulse gently, beckoning me to come nearer. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty, just a few old chairs and a dusty table, but the light was still there, hanging in the air like a fog. Then, out of nowhere, a figure appeared. He was dressed in an old security guard uniform, one that looked decades out of date. His face was obscured, but I could tell he was watching me. For a moment, our eyes met, and then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he was gone. The room plunged back into darkness. I blinked, trying to process what I had just seen. Had my tired mind played a trick on me? The figure looked so natural, so solid. I shook my head, trying to shake off the unease in my chest. I closed the door behind me and continued my rounds, but the image of that spectral figure lingered in my mind. After my shift ended the following day, I couldn't shake the experience. I headed to the security office to chat with Mark, the day shift guard. Mark had worked at the hospital for years and knew all the stories and rumors. As I recounted what I saw, Mark's face paled. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice as if afraid someone might overhear. "You're not the first one to see him," Mark said, glancing around nervously. "There's an old story about a security guard who worked here decades ago. He vanished without a trace one night. They say he just disappeared, leaving behind his belongings and no clue about what happened." I listened. My curiosity piqued. According to Mark, the guard's name was Richard, and his disappearance had been a mystery ever since. Some believed he had run off, while others whispered about foul play or something supernatural. The hospital had changed hands multiple times since then, but the rumors persisted. That day, I couldn't stop thinking about Richard. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that I needed to discover what had happened to him. It felt like a puzzle that had been left unsolved for too long. I could piece it together. As the next few nights passed, I became increasingly on edge. I started noticing small things. A cold draft in a hallway with no open windows. The sound of footsteps when I knew I was alone. And once, I swore I heard a faint voice whisper my name. The hospital felt alive in a way it hadn't before, like it was hiding secrets in every shadowed corner. Determined to uncover the truth, I dug through old records and newspapers, searching for any mention of Richard or unexplained events at the hospital. The more I found, the more questions I had. Every lead ended in a dead end or another mystery. Then, one night, it happened again. I was patrolling the East Wing when I felt a sudden chill. The lights flickered, and the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly in front of me. I turned a corner and froze. There he was, the ghostly figure of Richard, standing at the end of the hall. This time, he didn't disappear right away. Instead, he raised a hand as if beckoning me. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to move forward. As I approached, the air grew colder. I could see Richard's features more clearly now, a young man with a look of sadness in his eyes. He mouthed something, but I couldn't make out the words. Before I could react, he vanished again, leaving me alone in the dark corridor. That encounter solidified my resolve. Richard wasn't just a ghost. He was a message, a clue, and perhaps even a plea for help. I knew I was getting closer to the truth, but I also knew that the journey would only get more dangerous from here. The hospital held secrets that had remained buried for too long, and it was up to me to uncover them, no matter the cost. I had always known that the night shift at the old hospital was eerie, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. It all began with a faint glow emanating from the staff room, which was supposed to be locked and empty. I had just finished my routine patrol, ensuring all doors were secured and the hospital's perimeter was clear. The quietness of the night made every creak of the old building more pronounced. every flicker of the lights more noticeable. But this glow was different. It was soft, almost ethereal, casting long shadows down the dimly lit hallway. As I approached the room, my heart raced. The light seemed to pulse in rhythm with my steps. I reached for the door handle, hesitating for a moment. The cold metal sent a shiver down my spine. Gathering my courage, I opened the door and found the room empty. Empty, except for the figure of a man standing near the window. He wore an old-fashioned security uniform, the kind you'd see in photos from decades past. The shadows obscured his face, but I could sense his eyes on me. Before I could react, he vanished. One blink, and he was gone. The glow faded away, leaving only the dim overhead lights flickering intermittently. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a chill wash over me. I stood there, staring at the spot where the man had been, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. Had I imagined it? The old hospital had its fair share of ghost stories, but I had just now believed them. The following day, I couldn't shake the image of the figure from my mind. Over coffee, I recounted the incident to my colleague, Mark. He raised an eyebrow, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "You saw him, didn't you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Saw who?" I replied, intrigued by his sudden seriousness. "The old guard, the one who disappeared," Mark continued, leaning in closer. He explained that years ago, there had been a security guard who mysteriously vanished during his shift. No one knew what happened to him. It was as if he had just stepped out of the building and never returned. Some say he had been involved in something shady, while others believe he had left to start a new life. But the most chilling rumor was that his spirit still roamed the halls, searching for something or someone. I delved into the hospital's archives that day, hoping to find any information about the missing guard. The musty smell of old newspapers and records filled the air as I sifted through piles of documents. Finally, I stumbled upon an old newspaper clipping from the local paper, dated 50 years ago. It reported the disappearance of John Wilson, a night shift security guard. According to the article, Wilson had been diligent and well-liked, making his sudden disappearance all the more mysterious. I also found an old photograph of him in his uniform. The resemblance to the figure I saw was uncanny. The more I read, the more the puzzle pieces fit together. Wilson's disappearance had never been solved, leaving behind only questions and a sense of unfinished business. As I continued my research, I couldn't shake the feeling that Wilson's spirit had been trying to communicate with me. That night, the hospital seemed even more oppressive. The usual creaks and groans of the building sounded like whispers, as if the walls themselves were trying to tell me something. I made my rounds, but the mystery of John Wilson consumed my thoughts. What had happened to him? Why had he appeared to me? As I passed the staff room again, I felt a sudden cold draft, and the lights flickered again. I stood still, heart pounding, waiting for something, anything. And then, a faint whisper reached my ears, almost inaudible. It was a single word that sent a chill down my spine. Help. I knew then that I couldn't ignore this any longer. John Wilson's spirit was restless, and he had reached out to me. I had to find out what had happened to him and help him find peace. The air was heavy with anticipation as I made my rounds in the hospital that night. The fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, casting erratic shadows along the cracked, aged walls. The creaking of the old floorboards underfoot was a constant reminder of the hospital's age, adding to the eerie atmosphere. As I reached the end of the hallway, I noticed a faint glow emanating from the staff room. My curiosity piqued, and I quickened my pace, eager to uncover the source of the strange light. As I approached the door, the glow intensified. My hand hesitated on the doorknob, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I turned the handle and pushed the door open, half expecting to find nothing out of the ordinary. But what I saw made my blood run cold. Standing in the middle of the room was a figure dressed in an old security guard uniform, the style of which had been worn for a while. The figure stood motionless, bathed in the unearthly glow that seemed to radiate from the walls. For a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I blinked, hoping the figure would disappear, but it remained. The details of the uniform were striking. Worn, faded fabric, a vintage badge glinting faintly in the dim light. Shadows obscured the figure's face, but I could feel its gaze piercing through the darkness, fixated on me. My body froze, a chill running down my spine. I wanted to speak, to ask who or what this figure was, but my voice failed me. Just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure began to fade. It was as if the light that illuminated it was being sucked back into the walls. The figure was gone within seconds, leaving me alone in the darkened room. I stood there momentarily, trying to process what I had just witnessed. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the hospital's aging ventilation system. I felt a shiver pass, as if the air had suddenly grown colder. Unable to shake the feeling of being watched, I quickly exited the room and returned to the security office. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Was it a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination brought on by fatigue? The questions swirled in my head, but I had no answers. I checked the security cameras, hoping to find some explanation, but the footage showed nothing unusual. The glowing figure was nowhere to be seen. The following day, still unsettled by the night's events, I approached a few of my colleagues during the shift change. We rarely interacted outside of work, but I felt compelled to share what I had experienced. As I described the figure and its uniform, I noticed a peculiar look on the face of one of the older guards, Mike. His usually jovial expression turned serious, and he pulled me aside. "I think I know who you saw," Mike began, his voice low. "Back in the early 80s, there was a guard here named Bill. He was a good guy, always did his rounds on time and never missed a shift. One night, he just vanished. He left his post and no one ever saw him again. The strange thing is, some of the older staff claimed they saw a figure in the old uniform wandering the halls on the anniversary of his disappearance." A chill ran down my spine as Mike's words sank in. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Could the figure I saw be the ghost of Bill, the missing guard? The idea seemed incredible, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. The uniform, the eerie glow, the disappearance, it all fit. Mike continued, "There's an old file on him in the archives. You might want to take a look if you're curious, but be careful. Some things are better left alone." As I drove home that day, I couldn't stop thinking about the strange figure in Mike's story. The hospital, with its creaking floors and flickering lights, seemed to hold secrets I'd never imagined. As much as I wanted to brush it off as a hallucination or a trick of the light, the encounter felt too real, too vivid to ignore. I decided then to delve deeper into the mystery of Bill's disappearance. Perhaps by understanding his story I could find some closure, or at the very least, reassure myself that I hadn't lost my mind. The hospital was not just an old building with a creaky past. It was a place filled with untold stories, echoes of those who had come and gone. As I prepared for my next shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to become a part of one of those stories, whether I liked it or not. The morning after the strange encounter, I already felt the weight of the previous night's events. The hospital was as quiet as ever, its sterile corridors bathed in the weak light of dawn. I couldn't shake the image of that figure in the old security uniform from my mind. I needed answers. I headed straight for the staff room, hoping to find someone who might have heard of or seen something similar. The room was cluttered with old furniture and unused equipment, and stale coffee lingered. I ran into Lisa, one of the day shift nurses. "Hey, Lisa, can I ask you something?" I started, trying to sound casual. She looked up from her paperwork, her eyebrows knitting together in curiosity. "Sure, what's up?" "I had a weird experience last night," I said cautiously. "I saw something strange in the staff room, something I can't quite explain." Lisa's eyes widened slightly. "What kind of something?" "A figure. It was dressed like an old security guard, but it vanished as soon as I tried to get a closer look," I explained, noting her interest. "I was wondering if you've heard any stories about strange occurrences or missing people connected to the hospital." Lisa hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "Well, you might want to talk to Mr. Harris in maintenance. He's been around here forever and might know something." I thanked her and made my way to the maintenance office. The hallway seemed even more lonely than usual, the silence broken only by the distant hum of the building's ancient air conditioning. Mr. Harris was a grizzled man in his 60s, his face lined with years of hard work. He looked up from his desk as I entered. "What can I do for you?" he asked gruffly. "I heard you might know something about the hospital's history, particularly any disappearances or unusual events," I said. Mr. Harris' eyes narrowed, and he leaned back in his chair. You've heard about Tom Daniels, haven't you? Tom Daniels, I repeated, trying to place the name. He was a security guard here about 30 years ago, Mr. Harris said. One night he just vanished. There is no trace, no sign of struggle. People say the place has been haunted ever since. My curiosity piqued, and I pressed him for more details. What happened to him? Did anyone find out what happened? Nothing concrete, Mr. Harris said, shaking his head. There were rumors about him seeing strange things in the hospital before disappearing. Some say he was looking into something he shouldn't have. I thanked Mr. Harris and left, feeling a growing unease. I had to find out more. I spent the rest of the day scouring old newspapers and records at the local library. Most articles were vague, but one headline caught my eye. Security guard disappears without a trace. The article was brief, but revealing. It mentioned that Tom Daniels had been investigating unusual occurrences in the hospital, specifically in areas where renovations had disturbed old sealed-off parts of the building. He had reportedly expressed concern about some of the hospital's darker corners. By the time nightfall approached, I was both eager and apprehensive about returning to the hospital. I had to confront whatever was happening there. As I prepared for my shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that the past and present were colliding, and I might be on the verge of uncovering something far more unsettling than I'd anticipated. I spent the following day sifting through the old files and records of the hospital, driven by an uneasy curiosity that gnawed at me since that night. The sun had barely risen, but the musty corridors of the hospital were still cloaked in an eerie silence. The shadows stretched longer than usual, as if the building was reluctant to reveal its secrets. My investigation led me to the hospital's archive room, a dimly lit space filled with dusty file cabinets and ancient records. I rolled up my sleeves and dug through the files from the late 1970s when the missing guard had vanished. The musty smell of old paper and mildew mixed with the faint antiseptic odor still lingering in the air. I found a file marked Staff Records and began flipping through it. Most of the entries were mundane, names, dates of employment and routine details, but then I stumbled upon a thin folder labeled Incident Reports. My heart raced as I opened it, hoping to find something relevant. The pages were yellowed with age, and as I scanned them, one report caught my eye. It detailed a mysterious disappearance. A guard named Tom Reynolds had vanished without a trace. The report was brief, noting that Reynolds was last seen patrolling the hospital late at night, and his personal belongings were found untouched in the security office. There were no leads, no witnesses, just an inexplicable absence. I continued to dig, looking for more details. In one of the old newspapers I found tucked away in the back of the drawer, there was a short article about Tom Reynolds. It mentioned that he had been well liked by staff and had no known enemies. The article hinted at a possible connection to the hospital's old construction sites, where several workers had also disappeared under mysterious circumstances. My investigation didn't continue. I contacted some of the old-timers who had worked at the hospital. One elderly nurse I found at a local cafe recalled unsettling rumors. She spoke in hushed tones about strange occurrences, phantom footsteps, unexplained noises, and a general feeling of unease that permeated the building. As I listened to her, a pattern started to emerge. The hospital had always been a hotbed of strange events, and Reynolds' disappearance was just one of many eerie incidents. The nurse mentioned a room that was now off-limits, an old storage space that had once been a part of the hospital's original construction. According to her, this room had a reputation for being haunted, but nobody paid much attention to it. That night, armed with the new information, I went to the room the nurse had mentioned. It was in a far corner of the hospital, hidden behind a heavy metal door marked with faded caution signs. My flashlight flickered as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the room was cluttered with old equipment and broken furniture. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched as I explored the room. The shadows seemed to move independently, and the temperature dropped noticeably. I found a stack of old blueprints and construction documents. As I pored over them, I noticed something peculiar, an annotation about hidden passages and sealed-off areas that weren't included in the hospital's current layout. My pulse quickened as I realized these hidden passages might explain the strange phenomena and Reynolds' disappearance. If someone, or something, was using these passages, it could have evaded detection for decades. I returned to the archives the next day to cross-reference these blueprints with the construction records. The pieces were starting to come together, but there still needed to be a link. What connected these hidden passages and the ghostly figure I had seen? The search for answers was far from over. The deeper I delved into the hospital's dark history, the more I felt the oppressive presence of something ancient and restless. The unanswered questions loomed large, casting a long shadow over my investigation. The following night, I once again patrolled the dimly lit corridors of the old hospital. The peculiar sight I'd witnessed the previous night had left me restless, my curiosity about the spectral figure gnawing at me like a persistent itch. Every creak of the old building seemed to whisper secrets, and every flicker of the failing fluorescent lights felt like a prelude to something significant. The air was colder tonight, a chill that seemed to seep through the walls and settle deep within my bones. As I walked past the staff room, the very place where I had seen the ghostly figure, I noticed a faint, almost imperceptible glow emanating from beneath the door. My heart raced, and I paused, my flashlight flickering in response to the eerie ambience. I took a deep breath and slowly turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing the room in its usual disarray. Old filing cabinets, broken furniture, and a thick layer of dust covering everything. But tonight, the glow was more pronounced, a pale light that seemed to pulsate from the corner where an old desk stood. I stepped inside, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. As I approached the source of the light, I noticed a stack of yellowed papers on the desk. The light seemed to be coming from beneath them. My hand trembled slightly as I lifted the papers, revealing an old, tarnished Walter Hayes badge engraved on it. The badge was unmistakably the same as the one worn by the figure I had seen. A cold draft swept through the room and I shivered. I could feel a presence, almost like someone or something was watching me. I quickly pocketed the badge and made my way out of the staff room, my mind racing. The name Walter Hayes was familiar from the stories I had heard, but I needed more information. The next day, I visited the local library, combing through old newspapers and archives. My search led me to a chilling revelation. Walter Hayes was an evening security guard who had vanished without a trace 30 years ago. The reports described him as diligent, committed to his job, and well-liked by colleagues. His disappearance was a complete mystery, with no leads or suspects. Returning to the hospital that night, I felt a mixture of apprehension and determination. I had to find out what had happened to Hayes and whether his ghost was genuinely trying to communicate with me. As I patrolled the darkened halls, the strange occurrences seemed to intensify. Shadows danced along the walls, and footsteps echoed where there should have been silence. The temperature dropped noticeably as I approached the staff room once more. The glow was back, more intense than before. I hesitated for a moment, then entered the room. The old desk was as I had left it, but the badge was gone. In its place was a new stack of papers, each marked with the same strange symbols I had seen etched into the hospital's walls. They formed a pattern, a message from beyond. My flashlight flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Panic set in as I fumbled for my spare flashlight, the cold growing more oppressive. When the light finally flared back to life, I was met with an unnerving sight. A figure in an old security uniform standing by the door, its face hidden in shadow. I tried to speak, but no words came out. The figure raised a hand, pointing towards the corner of the room. As I followed its gesture, I noticed a loose floorboard. My hands shook as I pried it open, revealing a hidden compartment filled with more documents, personal letters and a journal. Flipping through the pages, I uncovered a disturbing truth. Hayes had been investigating something he wasn't supposed to. The journal detailed corruption and cover-ups involving the hospital's administration. It seemed Hayes had stumbled upon something dangerous, and it had cost him his life. I heard a soft, sorrowful whisper behind me as I read the final entries. The temperature in the room began to rise, and the figure slowly faded from view. The room was silent again, save for my ragged breathing. I knew I had to report my findings, not just for myself, but also for Walter Hayes. I hoped his spirit would finally find peace once the truth was exposed. The days dragged on, each night at the hospital seeming more unnerving than the last. I had tried to dismiss my experiences as tricks of the light or exhaustion-induced hallucinations, but every time I turned the corner, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The figure in the old security uniform lingered, and my curiosity grew more assertive. It was another cold, damp night when I confronted the mystery head-on. I had spent the day digging through archives and piecing together the fragments of the past, but nothing could prepare me for what I was about to experience. My shift began like any other, with the usual creaks and groans of the ancient building. The flickering lights cast eerie shadows across the corridors, and the constant hum of the aged air conditioning only added to the oppressive atmosphere. Around midnight, I noticed the familiar glow seeping from the room for the staff. It was the same eerie light I had seen before. My heart raced as I walked toward the source, footsteps echoing through the deserted halls. I reached for the doorknob and hesitated for a moment. This was where the figure appeared, and a part of me wanted to turn back, but my curiosity pushed me forward. As I slowly opened the door, the light seemed to pulse with an almost rhythmic quality. The room was empty, save for a few old desks and chairs covered in dust. I moved closer to the light emanating from an old, tarnished lamp on one of the desks. The light flickered, casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. I felt a chill run down my spine. Then, as if drawn by some unseen force, I turned to the corner of the room. Standing by a filing cabinet was the figure I had seen before. It was unmistakable. An old security guard in a uniform with a faded badge and a cap. The figure was translucent, its edges blurred and indistinct. I felt my breath catch in my throat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay calm. The figure did not move, but I could sense a presence, a weight in the air that made it hard to breathe. My mind raced, trying to reconcile what I saw with the logical explanations I had previously relied on. I took a cautious step closer, and the figure turned slightly. I could make out a face's features, though indistinguishable, as if obscured by a veil of mist. The ghostly presence seemed to be trying to communicate, but no sound came from its mouth. My heart pounded as I reached out a hand, but the figure evaporated into thin air before I could touch it. The room fell silent, and the light from the lamp dimmed. I stood alone, my mind reeling from the encounter. I knew I needed to understand more, but my fear was almost paralyzing. What did it want? What had happened to this guard? I had more questions than answers and was no closer to solving the mystery. As I left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that the ghostly figure had been trying to tell me something. The experience left me shaken, but it also ignited a new determination. I had to find out what had happened to the missing security guard, no matter how deep I had to dig. The answers I sought were hidden in the shadows of the past, and I was determined to uncover them. The nights in the old hospital had become increasingly unsettling. Each time I walked the darkened halls, I felt a chill beyond the natural cold. The lingering sense of being watched gnawed at me, more pronounced than ever. On one of these nights, I decided to confront whatever haunted the building. Armed with a flashlight and a shaky resolve, I made my way to the room where I had first seen the spectral figure. The soft hum of the fluorescent lights seemed almost deafening in the oppressive silence. As I entered the room, I felt a sudden drop in temperature. My breath formed small clouds in the air, and the hairs on my neck stood on end. I called out into the darkness, "Is anyone here? I need to understand what happened." My voice echoed off the walls, swallowed by the space. I waited, straining to hear any response. The silence was so complete that it almost felt like a physical presence. Minutes ticked by, and I thought the apparition wouldn't appear tonight. But then, I noticed a faint glow from the corner of the room. It was a soft, ethereal light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my anxious heartbeat. I approached it cautiously, every step feeling like a violation of the room's sacred emptiness. The figure materialized before me, clad in the same outdated security uniform I'd seen before. A shadow obscured its face, yet I could sense a profound sadness emanating from it. My heart pounded as I tried to steady my breathing. I took a deep breath and said, "I want to help you. Tell me what happened." The figure seemed to waver, like a mirage on the verge of dissolving. It extended a translucent hand toward an old security log lying on a nearby desk. I picked up the log, flipping through its pages. It was filled with mundane entries until I reached a final, incomplete note, scrawled in hurried handwriting. Something's not right. I need to get out. The entry was dated the night before the guard disappeared. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The sense of urgency in those final words was palpable. "What did you see?" I asked the figure. "What happened to you?" The apparition pointed towards the log and then to the corner of the room where a dusty old filing cabinet stood. I approached it and began rifling through the drawers. Most files were outdated or irrelevant, but I found a folder marked with a large red stamp. Confidential. The folder contained reports detailing irregularities in the hospital's operations, unexplained events, and an ominous mention of secret experiments. My hands trembled as I read through the documents. The hospital had been involved in something far more sinister than anyone had known. The apparition became more solid and focused as I pieced together the story fragments. It hovered closer, its presence a mix of desperation and relief. I sensed it wanted me to uncover the truth, to bring closure to its lingering agony. "Thank you," I whispered, looking directly at the figure. "I'll make sure people know what happened here and find out the whole story." The apparition's form began to fade, its light dimming until it was almost invisible. As it disappeared, I felt a shift in the atmosphere, as if a great weight had been lifted. The room grew warmer, and the oppressive silence began to lift. I was left alone in the now quiet room, holding the documents that would expose the hospital's dark history. The encounter had been terrifying and enlightening, and I was determined to ensure that the truth would not remain buried in the shadows. The night was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy and suffocating. I'd spent the evening sifting through old records and dusty files, piecing together fragments of the past. The more I uncovered about the missing guard, Richard Collins, the more unsettling the story became. Tonight, I was determined to confront whatever was haunting this place. As the clock struck midnight, I walked the dimly lit hallways of the old hospital, my flashlight casting long shadows on the cracked walls. The temperature dropped as I approached the room where I had first seen the strange figure. My breath fogged in the cold air, and the distant hum occasionally broke the silence of old machinery. I stood outside the staff room where the ghostly figure had appeared. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open slowly. The room was as I remembered it, disorganized and musty, with a few scattered old uniforms and dusty paperwork. I stepped inside, my flashlight revealing nothing but the usual clutter. Yet, the oppressive feeling that I wasn't alone made my skin crawl. I set up a small recording device in the corner of the room, hoping to capture any strange sounds. With a final glance around, I spoke into the empty room. "Richard Collins, if you're here, I need to understand what happened to you. Please, show yourself." For a moment, nothing happened. The silence was almost too perfect, too absolute. Then, as if responding to my plea, the room's temperature dropped even further. I shivered as I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, my flashlight illuminating a figure standing near the window. The apparition was dressed in an old, faded security uniform, just like I had seen before. The ghostly figure seemed to be a man in his mid-40s with a solemn expression etched on his face. His eyes, though hollow, seemed to plead for help. I felt a mix of fear and sympathy. "I'm here to help you," I said, trembling. "Please, tell me what happened." The figure moved closer, but its motions were jerky and unnatural. It pointed towards a filing cabinet in the corner of the room, then seemed to vanish, leaving only the cold, empty air in its wake. I approached the cabinet, my heart pounding. I rummaged through its contents and found a stack of old files, one marked with Collins' name. The file contained personal notes and letters Richard had written in the days before his disappearance. They described his growing unease about the hospital's management and the strange occurrences he had witnessed. One letter, dated just a day before his disappearance, detailed a confrontation with someone he suspected was involved in illegal activities within the hospital. Collins had been uncovering something that someone wanted to keep hidden. As I read the letter, a chill ran down my spine. Collins had suspected foul play and mentioned feeling threatened. He had written about a meeting he was planning to have with someone from outside the hospital who could help him expose the corruption. But the meeting has yet to happen. Collins vanished, and the case went cold. I realized that the ghostly presence was not just a restless spirit. but someone trying to reveal the truth from beyond. A sudden rush of cold air swept through the room as I finished reading the letter. The lights flickered, and the figure reappeared, standing by the door. This time, it looked directly at me as if saying goodbye. With newfound determination, I knew what had to be done. I needed to bring Richard Collins' story to the authorities and ensure the truth came out. I left the room with a heavy heart, but a more explicit purpose. The ghostly visitations had not been in vain. They had uncovered a deep-seated injustice that needed addressing. The night was still dark, but the weight of the mystery was now lighter, and I felt a small measure of peace, knowing that I could finally help the restless spirit find its justice. I stood frozen in the dimly lit hallway, the eerie glow of my flashlight flickering against the walls. The old hospital seemed to breathe around me, its decrepit structure creaking as if alive. The unsettling silence was broken only by the occasional distant hum of machinery and the whisper of my labored breaths. The air was colder than usual tonight, a sign of something otherworldly drawing near. The moment of truth had arrived. Armed with the documents and records I'd unearthed over the past few weeks, I headed toward the room where I had first seen the ghostly figure. Each step felt heavier, as if the floorboards beneath me were conspiring to pull me into the depths of this enigma. I reached the staff room door, the same one where the mysterious light had originated. The door creaked open, revealing the same dimly lit, cluttered space I had seen before. My heart pounded as I stepped inside, casting my flashlight around. The room seemed unchanged, yet something felt different, more oppressive. Then I saw it. The figure, once again dressed in the tattered uniform of a bygone era, stood in the corner of the room. The ghostly image was more transparent than before, its face gaunt and hollow, eyes reflecting a deep, unfathomable sadness. I took a deep breath, mustering all my courage. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling but resolute. "What do you want?" The figure turned slowly, and though its expression was unreadable, I could feel the weight of its sorrow. It raised a spectral hand and pointed towards an old desk in the corner. I approached my flashlight, revealing a stack of yellowed papers and a tarnished nameplate. The name on the plate was barely legible, but read, James Harper. James Harper. I'd come across his name in the records. He was the security guard who had mysteriously disappeared decades ago. I sifted through the papers, finding letters and personal notes about corruption and betrayal. Harper had uncovered illegal activities within the hospital, but he vanished before he could expose them. I felt a chill as I read through the final letter, written in a shaky hand. Harper had written about threats made against him and his growing fear for his life. The final entry was a desperate plea for help, a request for someone to discover what had happened to him. A cold breeze swept through the room, and the ghostly figure seemed to grow more distinct. It approached me, and momentarily, I felt its chilling presence envelop me. Then, with a sudden clarity, it spoke. "Help me. Reveal the truth," it whispered, echoing through the empty room. I nodded, my resolve hardening. "I will. I promise." The ghostly figure slowly faded away, leaving a sense of quiet and resolution. The room's oppressive atmosphere lightened, and the temperature returned to normal. I knew what I had to do next. I would take Harper's findings to the authorities, ensuring that the truth came to light and that justice was served. As I left the old hospital, the weight of the mystery had lifted. The night air felt refreshing, almost liberating. The ghost of James Harper had found some semblance of peace, and I had fulfilled my promise. The hospital's shadows would always hold a part of this story, but it seemed that its haunting had ended for now.